Still on the kinds of obligations. This time we will look at the obligation with the penal clause. Okay. First, let us distinguish the difference between a principal and an accessory obligation. Okay, a principal obligation is one which can stand alone or by itself and does not depend for its validity and existence upon another obligation. While an accessory obligation is one which is attached to a principal obligation and therefore cannot stand alone. So, i-apply natin ito sa obligation with the penal clause. The obligation is the primary or the principal obligation, while the penal clause is actually an accessory obligation. Okay? The principal obligation can stand alone even if without the penal clause. But there is no obligation na penal clause lang ang nakasulat, walang main obligation. That is why the penal clause is an accessory obligation. Okay? The principal obligation may or may not have a penal clause. But a penal clause will always have a principal obligation to which it is attached. So, an obligation with a penal clause is one which contains an accessory undertaking to pay a previously stipulated indemnity in case of breach of the principal prestation, intended primarily to induce its fulfillment. The penalty is a substitute for the indemnity for damages and interest in case of non-compliance. So, sabi dito, the penal clause is actually an accessory undertaking. Okay. There is an obligation, the principal obligation, which may be an obligation to give, to do, or not to do. However, the parties agreed na magkaroon ng penalty. Just in case that the debtor will not fulfill the obligation, okay, magbabayad siya ng penalty. And this penalty is generally a substitute for damages and interest in case of non-compliance. So generally class, kapag walang ibang pinag-usapan, the penal clause will become a substitute for damages. So that pag hindi gagawin ni debtor yung obligation, then babayaran niya yung penal clause. Okay? Parang yun na yung damages. Yun ang substitute for damages. So that hindi ka na pwede maghingi ng damages sa court kasi meron ka ng penal clause na nakasulat na just in case of non-compliance. So penal clause is an accessory undertaking attached to an obligation to assume greater responsibility in case of breach. Okay. So magjuju lang ang penalty na nakasulat sa penal clause in case of breach of contract or non-compliance of the obligation. Okay. And the penal clause will not, or the penalty will not take effect for as long as the obligation has been fulfilled by the debtor. So kinds of penal clause. Yung penal clause may as origin. It may be a legal penal clause when it is required by law. Okay. Number two, when it is agreed by the parties, then the penal clause will be called conventional penal clause. As to its purpose, okay. Number one is compensatory penal clause when the penalty takes the place of damages. Ito yung kanina, yung general nature ng penal clause. The penal clause is generally a compensatory penal clause, meaning in case of non-compliance or breach of contract, then the penal clause or the penalty will take the place of damages. Hindi ka nahingi ng damages kasi makakolekta ka na ng penalty. But sometimes, the parties agreed that the penal clause will be punitive in nature. Punitive meaning punishment. When the penalty is imposed merely as a punishment for the breach. Ibig sabihin, in case of non-compliance or non-performance, babayad ka ng yung debtor magkakaroon ng punishment by paying the penalty. But it does not mean that hindi na pwede humingi ng damages. Pwede pa rin sa punitive penal clause. Because the penalty is merely imposed as a punishment, not as a substitute for damages. Pwede ka pa rin humingi ng damages. As to its demandability or effect, subsidiary or alternative penal clause when only the penalty can be enforced. Ibig sabihin, class, okay, obligation with the penal clause. Kapag hindi i-perform ni debtor ang obligation, then babayaran niyo yung penalty lang. penalty lang. Hindi niya na gagawin yung obligation, kundi babayaran niya lang yung penalty na lang. So that is called subsidiary or alternative penal clause. Number 2 is joint or cumulative penal clause when both the principal obligation and the penal clause can be enforced. Ibig sabihin, ang agreement is, if you will not perform the obligation or you will not comply, you have to pay the penalty as well as you have to perform the obligation also. So dalawa yung obligation na ipe-perform. The principal obligation and the obligation to pay the penalty. So the creditor, in addition to the penalty, may recover damages and interest. Okay, yung sabi kasi natin kanina, generally, subject to the exceptions, subject to the agreement of the parties, generally, ang penal clause will take the place of damages. But the creditor, in addition to the penalty, may also recover damages and interest. In this case, number 1, when stipulated by the parties. Of course, pag i-agreehan nila. Number 2, when the obligor refuses to pay the penalty. Okay? Ayaw gawin yung obligation, ayaw gawin yung penalty, then you can go to court to ask for damages and interest. When the obligor is guilty of fraud in the fulfillment of the obligation or may dolo incidente. Okay? So in addition to penalty, pwede pa maghingi ng damages because of the fraud. Okay? The penalty there in the penal clause will stand for the non-performance, and for the fraud, you can ask for damages. So in case of non-compliance, the creditor may ask for the penalty or require specific performance. The remedies are alternative, not cumulative, or successive. So general class, sabi natin kanina, generally, if the debtor will not perform the obligation, then mababayad siya ng penalty. Okay? Generally, kapag subject to exceptions, okay, dapat nito, the creditor can choose between gagawin ni debtor yung obligation or babayaran niya lang yung penalty. Okay? But not both. If walang agreement. Pagka obligation with the penal clause lang, then wala nang ibang agreement, then the creditor may choose between the fulfillment of the obligation, which is specific performance, or payment of the penalty. So, alternative siya. Pili lang dapat. Okay. Except kung nag-agree sila later na obligation and saka penal clause ang i-perform. But generally, if the remedies are alternative, not cumulative, or successive. The creditor can only demand both if it is clearly granted to him by stipulation. So, sabi ko nga, the creditor can only choose between specific performance of the obligation or the payment of the penalty. Kapag ka walang klaro na agreement na pwede i-demand ang dalawa. Okay? So, pwede lang i-demand ang dalawa, the obligation, the specific performance of the obligation, and the payment of the penalty if it is clearly granted to him by agreement of the parties. If the debtor can choose between the principal obligation or the penalty, then the obligation is an alternative obligation. It is not an obligation with the penal clause. Okay? So if the debtor can choose between the principal obligation and the penalty, then the obligation is, take note, alternative obligation and not an obligation with the penal clause. Kasi may power si debtor to choose in this case. So, alternative obligation siya. The penalty is not demandable when the principal obligations cannot be fulfilled due to fortuitous event. Of course. Okay, di ba? No person shall be held liable for fortuitous event. So, yung principal obligation hindi na-perform ni debtor dahil sa fortuitous event, and therefore, the penalty is not demandable. Kasi excused si debtor in this case. Basta walang dolo, culpa, mora. Fortuitous event lang. So proof of actual damages suffered by the creditor is not necessary in order that the penalty may be demanded. The mere non-fulfillment of the principal obligation is enough ground for the debtor to pay the penalty. Okay. So kapag hindi nag-fulfill ang debtor of this obligation, okay, it is not necessary for the creditor to present evidence na na-damage siya. For as long as wala na performing obligation, then that is enough ground to ask for the penalty from the debtor. Of course, the courts, in the proper case filed by the debtor, may reduce the penalty if it is excessive. Okay, the nullity of the penal clause does not carry with it that of the principal obligation. Ibig sabihin, class, if the penal clause is void, yung principal obligation will not be affected. Ibig sabihin, the principal obligation will not be affected by the nullity of the penal clause. For example, you have the obligation to deliver a cell phone, and the penalty if you cannot deliver the cell phone, you have to give shabu. In that case, the penal clause is void. It is null and void, nullity. But the obligation to deliver the cell phone remains valid. However, the nullity of the principal obligation carries with it that of the penal clause, accessio sedit principali. Example, the obligation is to deliver 1 kilo of shabu. In case of non-performance, magbibigay siya ng 10 cellphone. Okay? Because the principal obligation is void, then also the penal clause will also be void. Because the penal clause cannot stand alone because it is just an accessory. The accessory will follow the principal. If the principal is void, the accessory will also be void. Accessio sedit principali.